Anybody who's in the weightlifting game or bodybuilding game should know who he is. If you don't, you've been living under a fucking rock for years. So, Stan, I've known who you are for a long, long time, right? And thank you for coming on to my show. And I remember a while ago how I really started watching you was how jacked and strong you are, or are still, say. And we can't hold on to it as we get older, as you know.
I'm just a shadow of my former self.
Yeah, that's some shadow you're rocking still. And I noticed that I was really watching you when you would speak in your car driving, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm like, what makes me say that is, you know, my Instagram blew up and all that shit, and I had difficulty talking into the camera at first. I'm not the most open guy on camera. You know, everyone has to get used to it. And then I'm like, how does Stan do it? So I'd hold the phone and I drive, and I don't have to think about looking into the phone because my mind's focused on driving. I could speak my content, whatever's off my mind, without thinking about it. I'm like, oh, that's why this fucking guy does this, you know? But anyway, so, you know, like I said before, I talk about all kinds of random shit, and I'm sure everyone quizzes you on subjects of wellness and testosterone and food. I'm sure you get a million of that. And, you know, I would just talk on the fly. And you're a dad, I see. And how old are your kids, by the way?
9 and 11 now.
All right, they're a little bit older. So you took them to daycare. You did all that shit already, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So my kids are little, right? I have a 7-year-old and my daughter's 4, and she's still in daycare. And yesterday, I'm walking to the daycare. So I'm walking in, I'm going to pick her up, and the baseball coach for my son's team is walking out. I've helped him coach before. He's seen me 50 times. And he's walking by me like I'm a complete stranger, like he's never seen me before. And he made it a point to like look at me a second and then like kind of look away. I went out of my way to be like, hey, what's up, man? And he was like, hey, what's up? And then I walk in, I say security guard, I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with people? They just go to a void to look at you. And I'm like, yo, guy, it's not like I want to grab you through the pants or anything. I just want to say what's up, you know? Anyway. Just thought that was funny. You know, I'm sure you've ran into situations like that. But anyway, so.
Yeah, I'm terrible about that. I meet thousands of people, and I have a really hard time remembering faces. I associate people with places, and I'll remember an extraordinary amount of detail if we have a conversation or if we did something. But if I just randomly am walking and I see somebody's face, I have a hard time placing it.
You know their face, though, but I'm terrible with names. I know their face. I know they're from somewhere. I know them, but I am the absolute worst at knowing people's names. I could have met them an hour ago and I forget their name, you know?
I do too. Yeah.
Yeah, man. So anyway, more on a serious note. So what comes to my mind when I think about Stan is, of course, how big and strong you are. And knowing your history of how you came up, you were, what you told me before, you were a soccer player and wrestler in high school, and you continued to play soccer in college, correct?
Yeah, I had a soccer scholarship in college, and then I started picking up lifting because I was so skinny, and just fell in love with. Yeah, that was the start of the whole thing. I was definitely the skinny kid.
Yeah, that's what made me start to kind of do it too. But I was a skinny kid with some muscles, and I saw the girls liked it when I took off my singlet, and that just fucking was a domino effect from there, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you obviously fell in love with bodybuilding, muscles. And then at what point did you realize that you were, because you said you were hypogonadal very young. At what point did you realize that? Did you not feel good? Did you start to not gain muscle the correct way? What was it that initiated you to go get tested or whatever it was?
You know, when I was in high school, my dad actually took me to the doctor because I had delayed onset puberty. And I was a junior in high school. I was 106 pounds. And, but the doctors back then, they didn't know anything, you know, it just assumed that time would tell. A lot of this conversation that I have is all in retrospect. It's all reflecting on those years and some of the lessons that I teach people about, you know, if I knew then what I know now. And the first lesson in high school was that I was working a swing shift at 7-Eleven from the time I was 12 to the time I was 16. I would come home from school and I would go to work, and I would be at work until almost midnight. I probably wouldn't get home till 12:30, watch TV till 1 in the morning. they're up again at 6. So I was only getting like 5 hours of sleep a night, and then I was eating at 7-Eleven too. So that's nacho cheese, chips with the pump cheese, and soda pop.
Who
So a
doesn't like the pump
combination.
cheese? Love the pump cheese. You gotta have the pump
Oh, a
cheese.
combination of not having sufficient diet and getting poor sleep. My body wasn't prepared to grow. And that was one good lesson. I actually talk a lot about that when I'm training young athletes in high school who are in weight classes. Girls who are distance running, guys who are playing, guys who are wrestling. And if they're constantly cutting weight, then I think it has a detrimental effect on their development. They might catch up later, certainly, but I'm just not a big fan of it. And then I got to college and I started lifting, and I lifted hard for years. I would say almost 3 years. I was 20 years old, and I was only 156 pounds. And I was lighter than that. I was 20 years old. I was even smaller than that. I went to the doctor and found out I was hypogonadal. I had varicocele, which is
Which
a
is
vein. Yeah, it's a vein in the testicles that doesn't drain sufficiently, and so you accumulate a lot of warmth, and of course that suppresses testosterone production, or can, not for everybody. But I didn't compete in my first show till I was 21 years old, and I was 156 pounds. So I was quite small, and a lot of that was a result of delayed onset puberty and testosterone deficiency, hypogonadism.
sure.
And so I was training hard. I was trying to eat.
You knew all the
train.
things to do. The only thing you probably didn't take was I don't even know. Maybe there was hot stuff when you were in high school. I speak about it a lot. Remember that supplement, hot stuff?
Oh man, we took it all, and had diarrhea. The weight gainers, which were just loaded with sugar.
Do you remember how bad the supplements tasted when we were growing up?
Oh, they were terrible.
Terrible.
And Weider's Gainers Fuel 1000. Then he released Gainers Fuel 2500, which was just
all sugar,
2.5 scoops of the 1000. Oh yeah, it was every sugar you can imagine. It was maltose, dextrose, sucrose.
Those old supplement stores I used to go to, and like, I remember I would drink something. I can't remember the name of it. It was called actually hot sauce. I don't know why I remember that. It was probably like 1990 or 1989. And I remember drinking this shit. Who knows what was in it, but it was god awful tasting. And now I tell people they have trouble losing weight and dieting. And, they have all these dietary, things that could help you with, sugar-free and keto. I'm like, if you can't get lean now, you have no hope. Because back when I was trying to get lean or doing, there was zero. I said it before. There was like one condiment that we lived on. It was like this Thousand Island sugar-free dressing. We put that shit all over everything, But very, very interesting what made you would initiate the hypogonadism. So what made me think about this, right, as you're speaking about that, and like I said, my brain goes all over the places. You see now that growth hormones being utilized and implemented to kids more often and more frequently. I don't know if it's due to the fact of parents being crazy and they have aspirations that a kid going to big schools, but I would have, from what I recall, when I was younger, I had a friend who was really deficient in growth hormone or IGF-1 elevation, and he was short in stature. As we were getting bigger, he was really small and didn't grow, and he was the one who got bigger and bigger. Now, my friend Gregory coaches all these kids wrestling. And to my knowledge, which I didn't know, what he told me is that a lot of these kids are using growth hormone. I said, a lot of them? What do you mean? Now, what is your opinion on that? What is your take on that? Do you think parents are just crazy to do this, taking their kids to the doctor, hoping for something? Or do you think kids now are realize that they're more deficient that they didn't realize years ago?
I doubt the deficiency is any greater now than it was years ago for active individuals. We do have a problem with obesity, and that can impact hormone production as well. It can, of course, testosterone converted to estrogen with the aromatase enzyme. People speculate a lot about why our testosterone is lower now than it was post World War II, because we have pretty good blood test statistics from those years with the military. And they'll say a lot of things, endocrine disruptors and, a host of, processed foods, et cetera, et cetera. it's energy toxicity, it's obesity, which now we're realizing. We used to think that fat was dormant in the body. Now we realize it's actually an endocrine organ, and it releases inflammatory cytokines, and that is the primary driver. I can't speculate without any proof that it's plastics or anything like that some people like to proclaim. We just don't have the trials to show it. Generally speaking, I think it's less activity and more obesity and increase in type 2 diabetes, or pre-diabetes amongst insulin resistance amongst kids. And so I think that's the primary driver. With the athletes, I don't see that to be the case. Some of them are overtraining, as mentioned, with the wrestlers and the dieting. We see it with women, especially distance runners, with what's called the female triad, where they have chronic calorie restriction. They suffer oftentimes from amenorrhea, a cessation of the menstrual period, osteopenia, which is a bone mineral density loss. And oftentimes it'll result in things like anemia, low iron, and hypothyroidism. It's very common in female athletes. And, it's not even the thin ones. I've worked with, last year I was in Arizona working with a high school girls softball team, and we run 40s as a way to measure their performance, timed 40s on laser. And we track those statistics, and over time, if some of the girls were underperforming, and in one case we went out there and two of them were significantly underperforming, and talked to the parents, find out they've been very fatigued and tired lately, and they would talk about stress in school and all this other stuff. And I said, well, get them a blood test. And I'm a huge proponent of that, obviously, because of my experience in high school and my hypogonadism in college. And I didn't discover that till I was 20, till I got a blood test and saw the results. And so I know some people some medical doctors think that's there's potentially a downside to that by creating pathologies or perceptions of pathologies that don't exist. And as your question was really focused on, it gets people to try and make medical interventions when they're unnecessary. But in this case, sure, that both the girls had anemia. And this was a result of both of them demonizing a whole host of foods. And ever since I started the vertical diet, ever since I've been training women since the early 90s, up to and including at a pro level, dietary restriction has been a huge thing. It's still a huge thing. And those guru diets of egg whites and tilapia and egg white protein powders and mounds of broccoli and a scoop of peanut butter was your standard, guru bikini diet. And it's horribly deficient in so many micronutrients. And that's why when I introduced the vertical diet, it was intended to be much more inclusive of the kinds of things that particularly women needed, iron being, a foundation of that, and B12, and of course, calcium and everything else that's on the list for thyroid function in terms of iodine, and for skin, hair, and nails, the biotin in the egg yolk. I just went right down the list, and all the things that I thought that they were deficient in, and I tried to get them to include it in their diet. But these young ladies they had demonized red meat, they were demonizing fruit, they were demonizing dairy. They wouldn't eat any of those things. But here are athletes avoiding sodium, which I'm not suggesting that's for everybody, but for athletes, especially in a hot climate, this was in Arizona, those are the things you don't want to avoid. And it resulted in, obviously, decline in performance for these ladies. So I do suggest a blood test for those people who have symptoms. In my case, obviously it was lack of growth, and in their case it was in a performance decrement. So but I don't suggest that when you get a blood test that means that you need to have some sort of medical intervention. If you've got low thyroid or low testosterone, it may just be that you're overtraining, you don't have sufficient iodine, you're not getting adequate sleep, you're overweight, and again, aromatase enzyme converting testosterone to estrogen. All of those things would be the first line, obviously lifestyle interventions. Maybe you've got apnea. All of those things would be the first line intervention. And if those didn't work within 30 to 60 days, it may be time to find out if there's an endocrinological problem.
I think for most kids, right, to simplify it, see to my audience, see how knowledgeable Stan is. This is why I watch him all the time. It's like sitting at like in front of a college professor teaching you and educating you on the subject. See, me, I can't speak as an eloquent verbiage as Stan can, but I can relay a message in a certain way. So, right off the top of my head, what I think what the problem is also with obesity and hormone is a lot of kids now sitting behind a screen playing video games, obese, they're not moving as much. And then it's a domino effect of that, and they're eating shittier processed food, more processed food. This is a domino effect to sitting, not moving. As we were kids, even if I ate hot dogs from 7-Eleven, one of my favorite things was I used to ride my bike up to 7-Eleven. I used to eat 2 hot dogs, a bag of Doritos, and 2 Hawaiian Punch. But then I'd go play baseball for 3 more hours. I wouldn't sit behind a TV like this. And now they have these. Did you see this? They have kids now that they're grown, but they have stretch marks. You and I have stretch marks in our creases of our armpits and on our thighs.
Sure.
They have it across their back from sitting. I was like, holy shit, look at this. There's a new whole generation of this strange stretch mark from sitting crouched down on the floor or wherever, playing video games. That is the first step of the problem, is what I think, is not moving. Because, I mean, kids, the food is obviously worse today and whatever they're putting in it, right? I had a crazy allergy attack yesterday and I don't really eat them. I bought a Fiber One like bun just because it's low cal. I was going to try it. Looked good. Impulsive buy. And the other day, I must have wrecked like 3 of them on like, lean meat or whatever. I thought I was sick. I was like, holy shit. My face went numb. I felt really awful. My stomach was messed up. And then subsided. I thought, oh, my kids are bringing home germs all the time or whatever. And then, I got better. And then yesterday I ate one and I was like, holy shit, my face is numb. But I don't get like runny nose and closed throat. My head was itching and I'm like, holy shit, it's those Fiber One buns. So meaning whatever they're putting in the food. But that's not only the problem. More the problem is the lack of movement, the consistent eating and even worse food, and the video games. And that's a domino effect to loss of hormones. Correct?
Yes, it can very well result in hormone deficiencies, no question.
Yes, that can definitely lead to that. I made a little list here to keep on track for you and I. All right.
Oh, that's good.
I never really do it, but I knew you were going to come with your A game, so I had to come prepped. So I remember like listening to you in your YouTube videos that, you worked. I don't recall. I kind of recall something like you're working with your mom and it was a donut shop or a diner or something. And then you said the 7-Eleven. I remember that. So I know this, like you said, you stick to the 3 big rocks now: sleep, food, and training. All right. Now I do remember this, and this is why I remember, because I wish I've stuck to this. And I still don't do it. You went to bed, even when you were younger, at 10 o'clock, very young. You weren't a partier like I was. I made all the big
in college.
In college, especially me, I was forget it what I was doing. I won't even tell what I did on, social media or YouTube. And as I get older, I'm trying to pull the path back. So maybe now thinking, this is why at your age, your body still could perform at the way it does. But then there's guys I know that still can perform a little, but it's the far and in between. Now, I still see the way you lift, and it is very impressive. Do you have any physical problems, like other than as you get off, of course, your strength is a decline. No one's the same as even when they were 35, 40, 45. But do you attribute, obviously, to that your lifestyle the whole way?
Well, when I was competing, of course, I exposed myself to a lot of stress and fatigue with the powerlifting in particular. And I suffered a whole number of different injuries. I had chronic tendonitis in my knees. I had hip tendonitis. I've shot videos on the mobility work I did with Mark Philippi, on my Keys to Pain-Free Knees video on YouTube, and I broke my back video on YouTube. I've had any number of acute injuries and chronic injuries over the years from training, no question. But since retiring from competing, I've worked hard to try and rehabilitate my hips and knees. There's only one lagging or nagging area, and I tore a rotator cuff late in my career. And so that'll irritate me if I'm not cautious about what kind of movements I do and how heavy and how frequently. But everything else, I'm just cautious about the load and the progression, which is really the primary driver of injury, is just training beyond your current level of fitness. And if you try and push the loads too quickly, and when either total weight or repetitive strain, same thing could happen if you're a runner and you run too many miles in a week and you're not adapted to that. That should be something that's progressed gradually over time. You're going to start to get those chronic tendonitis type injuries, and then you'll have to back off and rehab, and then gradually work your way back in. I think one of the biggest things that I did throughout my career, and this is all in retrospect, this isn't something I planned, which seems to marry up well with what Eddie Cohn did throughout his career. He competed in 2 powerlifting meets a year, and in between those meets, he would do bodybuilding. More volume, more reps, more sets from a variety of different angles. But he would progress those movements as well, whether it was behind the neck shoulder press or a single leg press or some bent rows. He had a whole host of exercises that he would utilize in between powerlifting meets that wasn't the big 3, and it wasn't, top singles, doubles, and triples. It was more in the 6 to 12 range of volume, more frequency. And that lent itself well to his cardiovascular fitness as well. Louis Simmons always talked about GPP, and even great lifters like Kokov would complain that his father made him do cardio in the off season, which would make him weak. But as soon as he turned on his pre-contest prep, there was a significant carryover in terms of his ability to increase his volume and recover from that heavier training because he was physically fit. So my going back and forth from powerlifting to bodybuilding to powerlifting, bodybuilding, every time I would diet down and bodybuild and increase my volume and frequency and really get my heart rate going, I think I would, what we know in the research, and people often squawk about this, is that 95% of health benefits are realized strictly from the weight loss itself, irrespective of diet. And I'm a big proponent of a clean, whole food diet, but the literature suggests that is in a distant second to just losing the weight and not carrying around all the extra fat in terms of mortality risk and all of those other inflammatory problems. And so that's one of the big things that I promote. Like when I started working with Hafthor Bjornsson, Brian Shaw, I made them lose, or asked them to lose, a significant amount of body weight, 7% of their total weight, in order to remedy metabolic syndrome, things like fatty liver, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, high LDL, insulin resistance. And so Hafthor was 440 pounds. I brought him down to 396, and he had a significant improvement in all of his biomarkers. And then when
his blood pressure was
it's fantastic.
10/60 at a man who's
almost
400 pounds, which is crazy.
That's right. And there's a whole host of things that we do with my high blood pressure quick fix kit. None of it's magic. It's multifactorial. We just make sure to employ, pull all the levers we can to control blood pressure. And if blood pressure can't be controlled with lifestyle, then it's important enough to actually utilize, telmisartan or a couple other medications out there to control it. If you want to, pursue that kind of physical, competition, you want to live through it and beyond it. Controlling blood pressure is probably the single most important thing that you can do.
Not to cut you off, Stan, but like all the things that you're touching base on, food, certain diet, the way you train. Now, today you see, and around me, I'm sure by you as well, guys start to get a little older. Now, testosterone replacement therapy, they think testosterone replacement is going to be the quick fix. They're going to feel better. They're going to overnight be turned into 22 again. But listen, man, I'm pretty educated in this. And I say that is the last stage. We should first look at your lifestyle. Let's start with your diet. Let's start exercising correctly, and then everything should fall into place. And then if that doesn't fall into place, then we move on from there. So even like, even guys around my age, and they live okay and they eat pretty good, and they don't feel the same. Okay. I said, they want to show student test. I said, stop right there. That is not the first answer to the question. First, there's 3 stages. I say we try to maybe supplement with some diet, magnesium, zinc, change your diet, exercise a little bit more. Then we could stage 2, maybe go to the certain medications that can elevate your testosterone naturally. It's an artificial, pretty much to create a natural response. medications like clomiphene, etc. And then if that doesn't do the trick, which often it does, because I know someone who just recently told me they started the medication, the clomiphene, and their test went up to 1,000 or 1,200 nanograms per deciliter. They probably felt like they were on testosterone. They felt their energy went up, their sex drive, etc. And then, you know, for those guys, maybe it doesn't pulse the same way it does for others. Then we could look at testosterone. But I'm sure you agree with me. There's tons of guys by me. All these guys walking around looking good, and they want to start shooting tests. They go out drinking every weekend or very often eat bad. Just to tell you guys, let's first change the diet first and exercise in your lifestyle. Then we go the other way. I'm sure you agree with me on that.
Oh, absolutely. And testosterone, like you said, it's not a panacea. I'll talk about a few things. One, it may be low because you're suffering from sleep apnea, or you may be overweight. And as guys age, and if their testosterone is starting to lower, they may experience getting weaker. Their body composition will change. They may have more fatigue. All those symptoms can also be attributed to poor sleep, which commonly happens. With us as we age, start burning the candle at both ends, got kids, the demands of work, the stress, etc. If you double down on the big rocks and you really improve your sleep and you get a CPAP for your apnea, and you are consistent with your training, you may, and you lose some body fat, you may remedy a lot of those problems. And that's even true when you get into things like ED, erectile dysfunction, or problems with your libido. A lot of times that's caused by insulin resistance, some pre-diabetes or diabetes as you age and get overweight and exercise less and start to see some insulin resistance, which is caused by fatty liver. At least that's the we call the twin cycle hypothesis, that it's just we call energy toxicity. You're just overeating, your liver will start to accumulate fat, that'll spill over into your pancreas, and that'll affect.
It's a domino effect, yeah.
It's a domino effect. People think that eating carbs causes insulin resistance, and it does not. Eating carbs will aggravate diabetes if it's been developed from NAFLD, from the liver fat. That's what happens first. If you don't have NAFLD, then your liver can handle the glucose that you eat, and your muscles can handle, storing the glucose until such point that the liver gets fat, and then it can't handle it anymore. And so that's what happens first. It's energy toxicity. It's not carbohydrates. Carbohydrates don't uniquely make you insulin resistant. They'll aggravate the symptoms of insulin resistance for those people who have type 2 diabetes. But the solution for that isn't just to cut carbs. That doesn't fix fatty liver. The solution to that is weight loss. That's the number one solution for insulin resistance is to lose weight.
Anymore. I'm going to call him Professor Efferding. I feel like I'm in a college course right now.
Well,
I wish I could relay this information the way he does. This guy's sharp as a nail. But anyway, I knew this would be one of these podcasts, and I'm sitting behind. Like I said, I'm getting educated myself. I'm enjoying the hell out of this. I hope my audience is as well. Not everything could be about slapping salami sandwiches and talking about this motherfucker walking up the street. I love having this podcast like this. Yeah. Let me ask you this question.
Well, I'm hoping.
Go on.
Shoot. I was saying, I'm hoping that the information is digestible for people so they know that I'm just trying to get them to take the appropriate action in the right order, as you just gave us a summary of. One last thing on testosterone therapy, people presuming it's a panacea with respect to low libido or ED. Oftentimes somebody will take testosterone, it'll improve their sex drive. But it's really, if you haven't solved the insulin resistance, then you're really just kicking the can down the road. Exactly. And then the insulin resistance will continue. It'll overwhelm the benefits of the testosterone. And you'll think the testosterone stopped working when in fact your insulin resistance just got worse.
Testosterone's a Band-Aid then. It's a Band-Aid.
At that point, yeah.
Yes.
It certainly works. It does a lot of things, but the insulin resistance is going to impede or stop any of that progress if you allow it to continue.
Sure. Now, you were just on someone's podcast, and they brought up the subject SARMs, selective androgen receptor modulators, right?
Yeah.
And I know about SARMs, but I don't know too much about each individual chemical structure, whatever. But you simplified it. You said, why pretty much, SARMs initiate side effects equal to, or even in some instances worse than anabolic steroids, and with less of a result. Okay.
Yes.
So to my audience, explain how SARMs exactly do work. And now to also this, they still, I don't know what the legality is or not, but some stores still sell them. And now parents who is not knowledgeable, or kids for even that matter, go into these stores and buy SARMs thinking they're a food supplement. Meanwhile, they're putting a chemical in their body that's could be worse for their HPTA and for their liver, et cetera, and their lipid profile as anabolic steroids. Correct?
Yeah, and we thought SARMs was going to have a more specific action without the side effects. That's what we thought, and it's because it's not a steroid. And in fact, what we saw in practice is that it did suppress testosterone, and it wasn't as effective as testosterone, and that obviously would lead people to take more of it, and it does have adverse effects, as you mentioned, HPTA access, so it can shut you down, and it's not nearly as effective. And it's bodybuilders and powerlifters will not just take testosterone; they'll take a whole host of other ancillary performance-enhancing drugs that also have a number of side effects. It's dose dependent, and a host of those drugs can, trenbolone in particular, and a lot of the orals can have significant adverse effects. But if you're just comparing testosterone, which we have a lot of research on for going back 50, 60 years, and the doses aren't too heavy, too superphysiological, and you're getting blood tests to see how you personally respond, because everybody responds differently. I know people could take 100 milligrams of testosterone a week and they'll get oily skin and acne and and gyno and the whole 9 yards. And I know people who can take a gram a week and have none of those problems. So it's very inter-individual.
It's interesting you said that. I just listened to a podcast, not just, but it was probably a few months ago. It was very, very educating. So often you hear that an individual will go for blood work and to a general GP who doesn't really know much about hormones. They're general medicine, not specific like an endocrinologist.
Right.
And, their range is in the normal number. And it's really like, what do they say? Common sense is not so common, right? So the range just say is 250 nanograms to deciliter to 900.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctor says to them, you're okay. You're 410 or 390.
Mm-hmm.
You say to the doctor, I don't feel good though. I have no energy. I'm fat. I have all the symptoms. You have to really be like understanding it's common sense. Like maybe this individual's walking around with a 680 his whole life. And now his testosterone dropped and his freeze down, his SHBG is up. It's all bound up and not being used, right? It's almost common sense that his testosterone is half. If you're walking around with half the volume of testosterone in your body, you're going to feel like half the man, correct?
Correct. And it works both ways. I'll tell you this, that you treat the symptoms, not the numbers. And and obviously we've gone over in great detail that at least initially you want to try and rule out any of the lifestyle problems. If somebody comes in with a 400 testosterone and they've got ED and they've had a significant body composition change and they're fatigued and what have you, and they've tried all of the lifestyle benefits, you treat the symptoms, you treat the patient, not the number. It works both ways. Lane Norton's lifetime natural, he's got an 1100 testosterone. Great. That's fantastic. I've worked with one of the strongest men on the planet who had a 400 testosterone, natural athlete. He sent me his blood test, and I asked him if it was his sister's blood test. And he was going through some injuries later in his career, and I was telling him, "Oh, just take Deca, take Nandrolone." He goes, "No, I can't, Stan. I'm drug free." And he was adamant about it. And he was 1,000-pound single ply squatter. And he had testosterone of 400. That's not uncommon. Even Olympic athletes, and probably likely because they're training to such a high degree that testosterone is suppressed, which often happens pre-contest to bodybuilders as well.
Sure.
But I think the average testosterone or amongst those tested was only around 400. And you're like, well, these are the greatest athletes in the world. How are they going to perform with a test of 400? And they are, at a high level of training, and so it is suppressed partly from that. But my point is that you can have a low normal testosterone and feel terrible, or you could feel fantastic.
I've seen that. So with that, recently a friend of mine shows me his blood work. He goes, he had the test of a 12-year-old girl.
Yeah.
But his free testosterone was the upper mid-range of the free. So I explained to him that's the available testosterone. That's why you feel pretty okay. Even though your
Yep.
total number is low, your
Yep.
free available usable testosterone is pretty much on the mid to higher end point from what I recall. So I explained to him why that is. You still feel strong, etc. All right.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, what you see is people go for blood work, and I go, let me read your blood panel. Because the doctor said I feel okay. And then I look at the blood panel, I go, this is missing 3/4 of the markers that could identify what the problem is.
Yeah.
You've seen that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Now answer this question. What is the reason for that? Is it the cost of the markers? Is it the lack of knowledge? Why do they do that? I mean, these are really staple important markers for someone like me to identify and to really pinpoint what the problem is. I even looked at my cousin's blood panel yesterday. He didn't even have a lipid profile on there. I go,
I
dude,
know.
I go, that's 50% of like you said, 3 big rocks, the hormones, lipid profile, and then there was none of the key vitamins. Zinc,
Yeah.
magnesium, vitamin D, Then because the doc goes, yeah, your testosterone's okay. My cousin's heavier. He's like, I have no energy. I'm like, you need a new doctor, bro, is what you need. You know,
There's a
but
couple.
why is that?
There's a couple reasons for that. One is insurers. They don't reimburse all the extra tests, and the doctors are, they're hesitant to make those prescriptions. And some doctors don't get reimbursed for tests that are presumably outside of their expertise. I've even taken my 90-year-old dad into a heart doctor, and they refused to do anything that was related to his liver. They wouldn't even do an AST/ALT. And so, or his kidney. They wouldn't do creatinine and bun, of all things. They were just looking at his heart. And secondly, because as mentioned earlier, and the folks at Barbo Medicine talk about this, Austin Baraki and Jordan Fagenbaum are very smart. A lot of people will get this huge panel of tests and then start treating problems that don't exist. Or it creates some anxiety for the individual that, something's out of range. And maybe they just don't understand whether it's significant or insignificant. And that is a concern. I like to think that we're big kids and that, you could make the same argument about stepping on the scale. Some people have an unhealthy relationship with the scale and it affects their mood and their behavior. And you try and educate them and say, hey, weigh every day and average the week and look at the trend. You can bring, I think, people up to speed pretty quick on a comprehensive blood panel on what things to worry and not to worry about. And you're absolutely right. I've been to many general practitioners over the years who have given me feedback on a blood test that I then later, based on the fact that I didn't really accept their knowledge on the test, I would go to an endocrinologist who would tell me exactly the opposite. And some specific examples of that are, one would be elevated RBC, hemoglobin, and hematocrit when you're on testosterone, which doesn't necessarily mean you have polycythemia. It's not necessarily dangerous. It's a very normal condition for people who live in elevation, and they are not asked to donate blood to remedy that. And so some elevation based on your testosterone usage is expected as part of what we call erythrocytosis. And it's in the absence of high platelets or high ferrets and high iron, it's probably not unhealthy for you.
Let me ask you this on that. So a doctor that I go to myself to get blood work, he goes to seminars to keep his education up on testosterone replacement, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
So is this true or not that, a regular general practitioner or a doctor may say, your hemoglobin is extremely high. Your iron's at 19. You got to go donate. Mm-hmm. He said new statistical research shows that the hemoglobin correlates to more of the oxygen level in your blood. Your hematocrit is the thickness. You have to look at the direct iron levels.
Yes.
Is that true or not? So for instance, for me, right, I take testosterone replacement, obviously, and I'm always at it's lower now because I donate more consistent, 18.5, 18.3, 19 it's been up to 19 and change. He says that's not to worry. My hematocrit has been a little elevated, not out of control, but my iron is always in a controlled normal range number. Is that true or not?
Yeah, I don't want to give a diagnosis to somebody without understanding the whole panel, but I would ask them to ask their practitioner or get a practitioner who understands the difference between polycythemia and erythrocytosis, which is what we're discussing now, and then to check a couple other markers. You mentioned iron. You can test hemoglobin at a blood test donation center, and they could tell you you're high iron, but they didn't actually test your iron. And so you do want to get an iron panel, look at your ferritin, your stored iron, and look at your platelets to see if your platelets are high, because that would be a better indicator of thick blood, a potential problem for your heart. And if ferritin is high, then you should donate. High iron is not good for your organs. It's not good for the lining of your blood vessels. And but if you over donate because all you looked at was your hemoglobin, then you're going to give yourself anemia. You're going to end up with low iron as a result. And there's other things you can do. One is just consuming dairy with your iron meals. Yogurt in particular is what I consume, but because calcium binds to iron. I used to have some iron elevation, the worst of which was the result of using a cast iron pan for my steaks, because you will absorb iron from that. And you certainly don't want to, men generally don't want to take supplements that have iron in them.
You're like a knight in the medieval times, drinking out of like a metal cup, cooking your steaks on like.
Yeah, my iron spiked. And fortunately, I get blood tests frequently, so it wasn't in my system for too long. And I had to go donate. But then subsequently, I started eating the dairy with the red meat. And now my iron's normal all the time. And I do have elevated hemoglobin as a result of the testosterone usage, but I'm not concerned about it because platelets and ferritin are in good shape.
So you always hear now, like, just off the top that, dairy correlates to inflammation in your body, and your C-reactive protein could elevate your C-reactive protein and cause cardiac inflammation to your vessels. Now, I know that you do consume Greek yogurt, whole fat Greek yogurt, correct?
I actually do skim because I like to get my fats from my eggs and my top sirloin steak. So it's really a matter of just... Yeah, it's not that the fat in the dairy is probably preferable. It's got what we call a milk fat globulin membrane that actually doesn't seem to elevate cholesterol, LDL in particular, Apob, as much as say a butter would, or a coconut oil, or a bacon, a high fat meat. But dairy is not inflammatory. Actually, all the literature suggests just the opposite. There's two things with dairy. If you have a dairy allergy, you need to avoid dairy. If you have a peanut allergy, same thing. If you have lactose intolerance, then you need to be careful of the dose that you consume. And some dairy is lower in lactose. Yogurt is lower in lactose, as would, say, a Fairlife product or even cheese. And we see that cheese, if you look at the research, all the PubMed trials, whether it's epidemiology or even the randomized control trials looking at its effects on Apob, is cardioprotective. It actually reduces inflammation. And in the epidemiology, the populations that consume the most dairy have an improved BMI. And even more recently, Dr. Stu Phillips out of McMaster University in Canada, who's kind of a leading researcher in hypertrophy and protein, he said that dairy has an independent benefit on BMI and performance, because as you mentioned, there is a potential impact on IGF-1, which is good for performance. And he recommends it for men and women both, to 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day, 3 servings of dairy, for those people who can tolerate it. And if you have an intolerance to lactose, then you have to watch the dose. And if you haven't consumed dairy in a long period of time, your lactase enzyme will downregulate. And so when you reintroduce it, you have to reintroduce it slowly, titrate it over time to allow your lactase enzyme to upregulate until you reach your tolerance level, because that's genetic and not everybody can consume as much as others.
So why I asked you about inflammatory markers in dairy is for the reason of myself. And this is why, as you get older, no one's on top of, when you're a kid, you just kind of gas pedal and you don't think about it. But as I got older, I got more on top of, maybe I'm in my 30s, I should go for blood work more often. And I go very regularly, go every 3 months, and I consume a lot of Greek yogurt. A lot. It's almost a staple in my diet. It's simple, it's fast, has a lot of protein. I enjoy the way it tastes, so it's something I put in my diet. I'm always on the go, whatever. But my inflammation marker is like virtually none, 0. It's very, very, very low due to the fact I eat extremely well, I exercise regularly, and I just wanted to ask you, how true does that hold, that you always hear, dairy initiates inflammation? And then you hear, there's so many contradictive things out there, like, and then what was the documentary a few years ago about, going vegan, whoever put out, and everyone bought that shit. And I even tried being vegan for a little bit until I started losing all my muscle. They made people digest the fact that, meat causes inflammation. Meat causes inflammation. I'm like, bro, no, it doesn't. It's the other shit in the croissants and the bagels you're eating is why your joints hurt. And they have people digest and believe that steaks and red meat and protein initiates inflammation in your body. Meanwhile, this friend of mine who's complaining about, he's heavy, and he omits the information that he drinks 2 solo cups of wine every night and smokes weed. Maybe that's initiating the inflammation in your body.
Yeah.
It has to be the grass-fed. He eats grass-fed meat and organic this, but then he drinks 2 solo cups of red wine and weed. But my body hurts because it's got to be the meat. It's got to be the meat.
That. Yeah.
Anyway, I just think.
Yeah. Well, inflammation is an interesting thing. Some inflammation occurs just from eating, and certainly more inflammation occurs from eating more at any given meal. It's a normal process, as is insulin spike, whatever they want to refer to them as. It's a normal physiological response to eating, is to have your insulin elevate, and that's normal as long as insulin resistance doesn't get too high for too long.
Circling, not to cut you off, circle back. Oh, go on. I'm sorry. Go on.
I was just going to say, what we see in the research is that when you get sufficient fruits and vegetables, fruits in particular, with the polyphenols, are anti-inflammatory, and also yogurt. We used to think it was the probiotics. There's not much good research, conclusive evidence for that. It's the fermentation. And the Sonnenberg trials out of Stanford found that 100% of the participants in their trial improved their gut microbiome diversity and density eating fermented foods, whereas the fiber eaters were broken up into 3 different groups. A third benefited, a third had no change, and a third actually had detrimental response to increased fiber. And again, very individualistic, probably has something to do with their existing microbiome health when that trial was implemented. But that goes back to some foods for some people can have great benefits. You just have to watch the dose, and it's very individualistic.
So I'm going to circle back to hemoglobin and red blood cell count in individuals who utilize testosterone and, TRT. And how I know is friends, I have friends who utilize TRT and steroids, whatever, and a doctor told them to take a supplement called Naringin. You ever hear of Naringin?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
it's in carrots, by the way.
It's in carrots. See, this guy knows everything, man.
Yeah.
Naringin. Now, he found that the doctor told him it will lower your hemoglobin, your hematocrit naturally by taking a vitamin. You don't have to, not have to, but it's not necessary for him to donate as often. And it actually lowered his total RBC. Is this true? That
it may. Yeah, the degree to which would depend on how much you consume and how the individual responds. But it also can help control estrogen. But a big problem, one of the other ones on these tests, is that some doctors, when they prescribe testosterone, also prescribe estrogen blockers. And estrogen is very important. It's important for strength. It's important for endothelial health. It's important for a lot of things. And you see bodybuilders driving estrogen down, and they end up with ED, and their joints start hurting. So that is something also to be cautious about when you're taking testosterone.
It's funny you say that. As we're younger, like you said, you were a huge bodybuilder and powerlifter, and of course you weren't. I assume you weren't as knowledgeable as you are now. That when I was in my bodybuilding days, it was a staple: testosterone, X amount of milligrams I took, and I just took Arimidex because that's what I thought would get me ripped and would lower my estrogen. Yep. Meanwhile, I was so lean, I had probably 0 aromatase enzyme. I had nothing to convert into estrogen. And then when I started getting a little bit sharper on my game, I would go for blood work, and my estrogen was in the floor. Thank God I felt okay, but maybe that's why my joints hurt all the time. Yep. But anyway, the point I'm making, I was stuck on an anti-estrogen for a while. And I didn't take a lot. I took 1 milligram of Arimidex. That's split in half. I didn't even need it. Definitively, I was never a crazy testosterone user, just due to the fact that I would lose all my hair and I was going bald. But who knew I'd look better bald anyway? I wish I would have shaved that shit off years ago. I wouldn't have worried. Then I would have been 1,000 grams. Anyway, so every time I tried to initiate the discontinue of Arimidex and Anastrozole, it would mess me up downstairs. I would start to get erectile dysfunction to serve up. I'm like, fuck, I got to do it again. I finally got away from it. I hope I'm not jinxing it. Every time I say some shit like this, I jinx myself. I had to wean away from it very slowly. Yep. And then blood work showing my estrogen started to come into that normal range. It was always below. Even though I felt okay and supercharged, I know it's not good. It's not good for your lipid profile. It's not good for your joints. All the things that you just said. But now I'm not getting the results yet of having a somewhat balanced estrogen. My body still, my joints hurt, whatever. But that's probably why my joints hurt, because I had such a low estrogen for a duration of time. Would you contribute that to that? Why I feel that way?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, and something that's really helpful for that is sufficient potassium, 4,700 milligrams a day, which you have to be deliberate about. You have to eat foods high in potassium. That's kind of why the foundation of my vertical diet includes a daily potato, some fruit, spinach, and yogurt. And those 4 things would get you over that 4,700
What's very
milligrams.
attractive about your diet, and I don't know too much about the vertical diet, but from what I do know is you eat a very well balanced diet. You have carbohydrates, you have protein, you have dairy. And I've always found that, and it's really simple. Like I said, common sense is not common. When you start to deviate for something altogether, you're going to be lacking in something. You know, you could abuse anything. So going too far this way is no good over time. Going too far this way over time. And I do with my clients initially for just caloric restriction. I do take out whole eggs. I do take out red meat for a certain amount of time. And I say it's a means to an end. We'll put them back in. But for now, since you're a mess, we got to take out those calories for now. And then from there, we'll start building. Do you think that's good information to give somebody? To a means to an end. Short amount of time.
You have to reduce calories to lose weight. You have to be in a calorie deficit. There's no question.
No question.
And I usually like to drop fats first to a point, because the carbohydrates are fuel for training, and all of the people I train lift weights. They work out. And so I'll use like an egg white blend, or a lean, like a top sirloin steak, and just use less of it. And then I'm throwing in the monounsaturated fats if necessary, the salmon, the avocado, the olive oil. But generally speaking, I can get enough fats out of just and then the fat-free Greek yogurt doesn't contribute to the fat content. But as long as I'm north of 60 grams of fat, and you don't have to go down that low. I'm just saying that once you get below that, you might see a compromise in sleep, in hormones, in fat-soluble vitamin absorption. That's kind of down about 40 is the threshold, 40 grams of fat a day.
40 grams.
You start to see those problems. So I leave a buffer in there, at least 60. Generally speaking, it's just a 2-to-1 protein to fat. If a 200-pound person's consuming 180 grams of protein, then they go 90 grams of fat. And then the rest is carbs. And that's based on, your workload and your total caloric allotment for the day. You just fill it in with carbs. And that foundation of carbs, as I mentioned, I start with the high potassium carbs, a daily potato, some fruits, and a little bit of spinach, and there's carbs in yogurt. So that's there's 98% of it right there.
Yeah. So for me, with my clients and what I've always, and what I apply was work for me. And not everybody's built the same, whatever, but
Agreed.
I've always found what works statistically over my clients is carb cycling. You eat them, then you don't eat them, you implement them back. And I try to keep things simple for people to digest and to stay the course. If they try to stay on something too hard, they're going to definitely fall off at a certain point. But I try to make it really, really simple for people, because at the end of the day, you have to like what you eat, right? That's
100%.
There's only a couple main things you like in life. Like as a man, as we're cave people, sex and food. Other than that, we're pretty happy if we have those 2 things. Give me a steak and give me sex, and I'm all right. So people have to enjoy what they eat. So I try to keep them on the lane and keep it as simple as possible, because I've made the mistake in the past. I'm a little shot in the fact that I could walk around 12 to 14% body fat and I wouldn't take off my shirt on a vacation. People would be astounded and happy with that. I like to go down to single digits. I like to walk around in a bathing suit and say, yo, that's impossible for 40-something, know? And you're the same way, I'm sure. You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
I'm a little crazy. So I regurgitated my craziness to normal people. And I just started to realize, I'm like, wait, I can't do this. So I do it in stages with people. And like I said this on the last podcast, what I do with people to keep it real simple. And it's crazy how people drink their calories. I say, stop drinking your calories, stay on. If it doesn't come for it, don't eat it. No breads and no pastas. And then we could start manipulating shit but at that point, you should be on, you got the ball turning and rolling, where we could start manipulate macronutrients in a certain way where you could get the results and stay on course, So you talk about your 3 big rocks, which is sleep, which I definitely do not get enough of, just due to the fact of I'm building a business and my brain and anxiety wakes me up. Kids, Food I'm on point with, even though I'm busy, I still eat very good. And when I do eat, it's 90% of good, and my exercise on point. So rocks that stick, certain things stick in my head, and everything with training and nutrition and hormones stick in my brain. Nothing else in life. I do know this about certain vitamins, and correct me if I'm wrong. It's citrus bergamot, nattokinase, K2D3, and what was the other one? But anyway, I can't recall who said it, but those are the three main ones for like TRT and for overall wellness when you're utilizing testosterone. Nattokinase is to keep the blood viscosity down, correct?
Yeah, some people take it to lower LDL as well.
LDL, okay.
Yeah.
Citrus bergamot does the same, correct? Lowers LDL?
Yeah, it can.
And K2D3, from what I know, it can eliminate the plaque that is built up on the arterial walls and redisperse it back into the bones. Correct? K2D3 combination.
I'll say yes. That is. Here's the challenge: is that there's conflicting research, and the concept of reversing existing calcification has not been proven with any of those methods. And I know that there's a lot of claims have been made about nattokinase and K2 in particular, but we don't see it. May be able to slow the progression, but having said that, slowing the progression of calcification doesn't necessarily affect mortality risk for heart disease. I know that seems confusing, but if you have existing plaque buildup, the calcification of it is actually better than having the soft plaque. And we just don't see evidence that it improves mortality risk is the problem. It's not convinced.
Statins can actually flatten down the soft, gooey plaque.
That's what statins can do that as well. And the challenge with cardiovascular disease and all the research on it is it's a very long term. It's a 40-year disease. The average age of first heart attack is 65. And of course, the average symptom of the first heart attack is death. And so it is compelling, but we see teenagers, certainly the military has done a lot of work and sees teenagers and guys in their early 20s starting to lay down plaque. We see it in Mendelian randomization trials with people who have a predisposition for either PCSK9 knockout gene that prevents them from accumulating plaque. They never accumulate plaque, and they never have cardiovascular disease. They never die of clogged arteries. The problem with a lot of the interventions on cholesterol are they tend to be pretty short term, and they also tend to work. This is kind of confusing to explain, but if you're comparing the difference between somebody who consumes 4% saturated fat in their diet to somebody who consumes 9% saturated fat in their diet, you're not going to see any difference. And if you're comparing the difference between somebody who consumes 21% saturated fat in their diet and 28% saturated fat in their diet, you're not going to see any difference. But if you compare somebody who consumes under 10% to somebody who consumes over 20% of saturated fat as a percentage of total calories, you see an enormous difference in cardiovascular disease risk and mortality risk. So there does seem to be a threat. It's what we call a sigmoidal curve, an S-shaped curve. And a lot of times when people put forth research suggesting there's no mortality risk increase from increased saturated fat income, they're working in one of those two ranges only, and they're not comparing the difference between the bottom and the top range. And that's one of the confounding features of that research. Additionally, when you've got elderly people who live longer with higher LDL, and so you claim that LDL is good for their health at that point because people's lower LDL that are elderly tend to die sooner. The confounding variable there is it suffers what we call reverse causality. Older people who get cancer or some other disease, it drives their cholesterol down. The cancer drives the cholesterol down. The cholesterol doesn't cause them to be more or less healthy. And so you would see that elderly population dying with low cholesterol, but it's not from the cholesterol.
Sure. So I often, again, going back to blood work,
Yeah.
someone's like, oh, the doctor says I have high cholesterol. I got to watch this and this and this. I go, let me see your panel. I look, their LDLs are slightly elevated. Now correct me if I'm wrong. Statistically, wasn't the acceptable range not that far past 130 and now it's 100?
Yeah, and that's kind of like blood pressure, because we do continue to see a decreased mortality risk as those numbers go down. The problem is it's not linear. It has, diminishing returns. We call asymptotic, to where how much time and energy are you going to invest into getting that lower and lower and lower, and what's your increase in lifespan. It's multifactorial too. If you don't have diabetes, you don't have high blood pressure, and you don't have compromised endothelial function from, like we talked about, high iron or something like that, then those are all contributors to your total cardiovascular disease risk. And certainly ApoB, which I know that might seem like a new term to some people, but that's actually the atherosclerotic particle that's on the LDL and the VLDL and the chylomicrons. That seems to be the particle, or is the particle, that actually can penetrate the endothelial lining and create the plaque accumulation. So we measure ApoB. That's, nowadays we don't measure total cholesterol. LDL is it moves up and down, but not on everyone. ApoB is the specific marker that can tell you what is one of many risk factors. It is an independent risk factor. High ApoB can cause plaque accumulation. But how high for how long, and what are your other, and how healthy are you otherwise, that it might limit it from progressing as quickly. So that's why you get a lot of this carnivore community and others, keto community, talking about these lean mass hyper responders, which even Dave Feldman acknowledges it's 1 in 30,000 people who have extraordinarily high HDL, very low triglycerides, but have very high LDL, maybe 200, 300. And he says that they don't have the same susceptibility to risk, although when you stratify those people in the trials, when you just look at the lowest, at the people with the best HDL, triglycerides, insulin numbers, there's still a difference between those whose LDL is over 130 and under 130. There's still an increase when you compare those people in that stratified group. And but what's the story? I mean, what's the it's hard to say. Everybody gets to determine for themselves based on the whole picture, their current level of health, their HDL, LDL, their insulin resistance, all of that, their blood pressure. Maybe that has them accumulate plaque at a faster rate such that they pass away 1 year earlier. I don't know.
Sure. Now,
but it's not something you feel.
So how true is this? Okay, so is it ratios? Now, I said it's not definitive that it's bad or unhealthy or your arteries are compromised if you have an elevated LDL or total cholesterol. It's about your HDL to LDL ratio. So isn't there?
That's a marker. That's a marker of health. I mentioned it's multifactorial. That would, you look at all of the potential cardiovascular disease risk contributors, and those people with type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance are going to have a much higher mortality risk, especially if they have high LDL. And if you have low insulin resistance and you have high HDL, low triglycerides, you're going to have less mortality risk but it's still an independent risk factor if you want to control everything. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily go on statins, but I got to be honest, lifestyle doesn't seem to move LDL around much. It's a genetic predisposition in many cases. Some people are hyper absorbers. Yeah, some people can eat.
Friends that cycle, their urics are in unbelievable shape. I have a friend who's 57, 58 years old. He cycles like he's 22. He lifts weights. He's in phenomenal shape. He's in, I told him, as you get a little bit older, you were the 10% in your 30s, then you were the X% in your 40s. I go, dude, you're almost 60. You're like the 0%. No one's like you at 60. And it's crazy. And he's very on top of his blood work. He takes a very little small amount of TRT, but his LDLs are always up. Now that's genetic. I definitely relate that to. I know his diet's very good. It's just genetics. Some people just create and a lot of just genetics, correct? Why they
Yeah,
have an
there's a few
elevated
things.
LDL.
Some people are hyper absorbers of cholesterol. About 20% of the population will have an elevated LDL from eating eggs, whereas the balance of the population will not. Some people excrete cholesterol at a much better pace than others. And that's where the saturated fat comes into the conversation. Is saturated fat will reduce the number of LDL receptors on the liver that help to clear cholesterol from the system, which allows it to accumulate. And that's the conversation that's always had about saturated fats. And again, it would have to be over, the American Heart Association recommends under 7 or 6% of total calories. But generally speaking, the research shows under 10% of total calories. And that's not hard to comply with. So there's two things you can do. Exercise really isn't one of them, to be honest with you. And that might control blood sugars and inflammation. But as far as LDL goes, there's really only two lifestyle things you can do before you start looking at medications, or even natural, like we talked about, supplements that might reduce LDL. One is to reduce saturated fats, and it seems that butter is worse than, say, other forms of dairy because of that milk fat globulin membrane is destroyed during the processing process. Things like butter, bacon, coconut oil, palm oil, things like that are really super high in saturated fat. You might want to minimize those, reduce those, and then increasing soluble fiber.
So I'm
helps.
sure
And
as you
those
as you growing up or when you were in younger days, and why I'm saying this, I have a couple friends of mine and I'm a little younger than you. They're my age and they're too old to be doing this. They're literally blowtorching the candle at both ends. They drink, they party, they eat bad. And I tell them with the steroids, I go, dude, these are not fucking it's not creatine, bro. You could have really adverse side effects and you will be sorry when it's too late. So you said, why I'm saying is this. You said something the other day, and most bodybuilders are not in tune. Some are very educated, most are not. Let's be real. They just gas pedal it. They don't realize the side effects. Someone was telling me, this guy in Brooklyn, he's fucking, just got out of prison. He's taking 1,000 milligrams of this for 3 years and this, and he's eating salami sandwiches. You jack to go, yeah, and then he's going to fucking die one day of a massive heart attack or something. That's actually going to happen to certain people. Some people never have plaques. Some people do. Anyway, the point of what I'm saying is you said something about and mentioned it's not a bad idea for bodybuilders to maybe implement the statin into their regimen. For those who are not as knowledgeable, who aren't going to eat the way we do, and to simply they're throwing the smorgasbord of shit into their blood just to lower your LDLs. Now, anabolic steroids do drive up their LDLs on their own. Correct? So now they should probably, guys, just to control your LDLs a little bit, take a statin, because you're not going to listen to me or Stan, just because the day's going to come where you're like, fuck, I should have did this. Now, do you agree with me for guys who just gas pedal it, who don't give a shit, to maybe just implement the statin?
Yeah, let me dive into that a little bit, because I didn't used to believe that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. One, get a blood test. See if you have high LDL ApoB. That's a good indicator that you need to do something. And if the lifestyle intervention of lowering saturated fats and increasing soluble fibers doesn't work, and you intend to be a bodybuilder, particularly in the off season, especially if your blood pressure is elevated, then you can introduce a statin. And here's what's interesting about statins. And the reason why I didn't believe this 15 years ago is because they would use high dose statins and you get a pretty high incidence of myalgia, of muscle pain and soreness. The medicines have evolved, and now with the new statins, they also have interventions that are not statins. The new rosuvastatin has very low, especially in low doses, has very low side effects. And then they couple that. Now they do dual therapy. They use an ezetimibe, and ezetimibe is not a statin, and it actually helps decrease the amount of cholesterol that's absorbed, while the statin will increase the amount of cholesterol that's excreted. So you're working on both ends. And then if you can afford it, the PCSK9 inhibitors are unbelievable. They'll reduce statin by 50, 60, or reduce LDL by 50, 60% in 30 days. Right. And that's, again, if you are suffering from all the potential markers, there's no reason why not. Just as it's no reason why not you shouldn't take a blood pressure medication if you have high blood pressure and can't remedy it with a CPAP and exercise and more potassium in the diet and those sorts of things. Weight loss.
Stan is beyond knowledgeable. I thought I was knowledgeable. Stan is literally a professor. I'm going to turn the wheels a little bit on this.
Okay.
And this is very educating. I hope my audience loved it as much as I am still. So my audience loves stories. I tell very good stories. I put people at the construction site or whatever it may be, right? So you being old school like myself, having tons of experience in the gym, I want you to just think, so because I have very distinct memories and certain times in a gym, and whatever it may be that comes to your head, what is probably the craziest or the wildest gym situation or story that you could think of, and you could tell the story to my audience? Because like I said, my audience loves stories.
Yeah,
spin the wheels a little bit.
Boy, you put me on the spot. So much has happened. It was a whirlwind for me because I came back to competing after 10 years off. I competed from 1988 to 1997. And then I spent about 10 years working and developing a number of companies and became successful in real estate and telecommunications. And
I remember.
And then when I had the time and the resources, I was still passionate about trying to get my pro card. So I came back in 2006 after 10 years off. Competed in 06, competed in 08, finally met Flex Wheeler, and he trained me all the way through till 2009 when I won my pro card. And then later that year, I went to Mark Bell, and he trained me to win to set the all-time world record in powerlifting. And then shortly after that, Mark Bell started doing the YouTube content with me. And shortly after that was the world's strongest pro bodybuilder with all
you were probably one of the strongest pro bodybuilders.
Yep, certainly at the time. I definitely had the highest 3-lift total. There's no question about that. And there was Johnny Jackson, and Ben White was a big bencher, and Ronnie was since retired. He wasn't. We were just looking at his old numbers.
What did you weigh at your heaviest? What did you weigh at one?
I got up to 305 at the world's strongest pro.
And how tall are you? How tall?
6 foot. Yeah, 6 foot.
Big.
Yeah, it was pretty heavy. It was heavier than I needed to be. I competed at 275, but that was a specific circumstance under which I just wanted to get as big as possible. And interestingly enough, and we kind of touched on it a little bit, and I don't mean to get off track, but this is an important lesson especially for our young listeners. In the 90s, I told you I was 158 pounds in my first, 156 pounds in my first bodybuilding show when I was 21 years old in 1988. By 1995, I was almost 300 pounds.
Wow.
I got on testosterone, obviously from being low T. I got on testosterone when I was 20 years old. And I had just started bulking. And of course, I acquired sleep apnea over that time. As soon as I got north of 240, I had to get a CPAP. It was back in the early 90s. I've been using one ever since. And I bulked up to 300 pounds. I deadlifted 782 pounds raw with no belt in competition back in 1995 on 2 cc's of Sustanon a week and one 20 milligram D-ball a day.
The Russian Sustanons with the paper.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think mine were those glass vials from Tijuana, the old.
Or Pakistan, right?
Yeah. with the 18 gauge needle on them. It was nasty.
Yeah, there you go. I remember those.
But for a number of years there, from the time I was 20, I would just use 1 cc a week when I could get it. And I would cycle on and off. You'd do 8 or 12 weeks on, and then you're supposed to do an equal amount off. All the beginner mistakes. Now I really don't recommend that because you just lose all your muscle. So I do the blast and cruise for my competitive years. Nowadays, I just on HRT, I do 50 milligrams every other day. Occasionally, I'll take a 20 milligram Anavar before workouts just to get spicy.
Just get a little boost.
I don't know what it does. It's mostly mental.
That's the old meathead still coming out, and you never leave it alone fully.
Yeah, the point of that conversation is that I was really big and really strong on what would be considered today to be a very, paltry dose of testosterone, 500 milligrams a week. And 20 milligrams of D-ball a day.
500 milligrams a week, I always found was the perfect number, my wheelhouse, meaning I yielded the best results with the least side effects. I did 1,000 for a long time. Don't get me wrong. I was big. I was actually looking at old pictures that I was just at my uncle's house for dinner, and my aunt put on this whole Italian fucking feast of ravioli lasagna was insane. I ate 4,000 carbs that day. But, and the pictures from when I was like 22, my head was the size of a cantaloupe. I was like, I looked at
That
my
was
wife,
me
I'm like,
too.
I was like, I cannot believe you dated me. I looked like
Yeah.
Mario Lopez went on an apple pie eating contest, and I was just shorter and uglier. That's exactly what I looked like. I'm like, I can't even believe you went out with me on a date.
When I
Point
go
of
look
what?
at those 300-pound pictures, my head is enormous. It's hilarious.
Enormous. That's the
But
first place I get is in my face. It's crazy.
yeah, me too. To bring us forward, and that was my experience back then. And I would, I would recommend that that's a sufficient dose. That if you can't grow on that, you're probably not going to grow, and maybe this sport isn't for you.
I know
I come back. I come
bodybuilding
back in.
coaches. Go on. I'm sorry. Go on.
Yeah, I come back in 2006, and I'm doing bodybuilding doses. 2008 competed again. 2009 to win the my pro card flexed me on about 900 milligrams a week, which wasn't an extraordinary amount. It was just a little test and Masteron and some Winstrol and we did a little bit of it's like 50 milligrams of Tren every other day. So, but added it all together, it was about 900 milligrams a week, and that was probably my biggest dose, probably my heaviest cycle. It was right there at that point in 2009. And then I went to train with Mark Bell at Super Training, and everything went to hell. I asked Mark what a typical powerlifting dose was, and he's like, well, you need 750 test, 750 DECA, 750 EQ, and 50 milligrams of D-ball a day. So I jumped on that, and I was up to 3 grams a week for 7 straight weeks. I put on, after competing in a bodybuilding show, I put on 35 pounds in 7 weeks and set a world record in powerlifting. But the numbers weren't, I was benching high 500s in the mid 90s, and I was squatting over, 750 in the mid 90s. I was deadlifting almost 800 in the mid 90s on the much smaller dose. And I think the biggest thing with Mark, I took more stuff. I did get my weight back up. But we changed my technique, especially my squat, significantly, which added about 50 pounds to my squat that couldn't be attributed to the extra drug use. And I saw significantly more side effects. Obviously, I was only on that cycle for about 7 weeks, and I would cycle down for bodybuilding. But then every time I would power lift after that, I went back to 3 grams. And I was quite successful. I don't know if this conversation convinces anybody that more isn't better than less.
Definitely won't.
But I'm trying to sell them on the fact that I was pretty darn close on a lot less. And there were a lot of other things that happened training with great coaches that I think made a bigger impact than the high doses. And there was a time there at the World's Strongest Pro Bodybuilder and a subsequent meet that I'd swapped out, I took out the DECA and I put Tren in. I never used Tren in the off season because of the side effects primarily. I would use a small amount pre-contest because it really got you shredded. It was veins all through the abs. It really did. But you only needed a little bit because you were already pretty lean. The one time I used Tren in the off season to bulk with, or to compete in a powerlifting meet, was the first time was at the World's Strongest Pro Bodybuilder. I actually got weaker. I lost weight. I had insomnia, night sweats, and I actually got a little bit weaker. And I was 305 pounds at the Olympia, and I was weaker than when I competed at 275 the year prior. My numbers weren't as high. I barely got an 800-pound deadlift, and I've deadlifted 822 on numerous occasions.
Sure.
I barely hit a 600-pound bench, and I've done 606 in competition. And I got a 620 bench, but I was wearing a single ply.
Yeah.
And I've done 606 raw. So I wasn't any stronger at the Olympia, but my blood test was horrendous.
Horrific.
It was terrible. My liver enzymes were through the roof. So I don't know if all of that. I don't know if any or all of that qualifies as a general story as opposed to a specific story, but boy,
that's good. That's a good story just to tell the wild ride. And, it's also just trying a lesson to the younger that, and I say this always, and you learn from your mistakes. I wish I would have cycled more, but that's not how life is. I didn't have the knowledge I have now. And you use anabolic steroids as a tool, not a crutch, to keep gaining, come off. You shouldn't just rely on them to grow, because a lot of people just rely on the drug a lot, where the first basis should be hard training, build a great foundation, good food, and then you could turn to steroids. That's, you know, I did have a very good solid foundation, and I did actually grow. Maybe it was all the hot stuff, like I said in high school, but I did have a solid foundation, and I just would have made some better choices. So what Stan is telling everyone is make some better choices. Don't always just rely on the steroids, and you do not need as much as you think. A little bit could go a long way. Correct?
Yeah, if that's the only lever you're pulling every time you run into a plateau, you're going to be very disappointed, and you'll compromise your health most certainly. Once you realize that it makes everything else better, then you do everything else.
Yeah,
And
sure.
and don't just rely on that is what the point is. And people confuse side effects with effects. Just like when we used to take hot stuff and get diarrhea, we thought, "Oh, this is working."
Yeah, I'm sweating that night. It's
Right,
I'm trend coughing. It's got to be good trend.
right. It's got to be working,
Insane.
and it's side
It's
effects.
funny.
It's not effects. Yeah.
Anyway, Stan, I'm gonna wrap this up now. But
Thank you, brother.
thank you for having me. Thank you for coming on to my show. Very educating. I hope my audience loved this. Now, Stan, do you want to plug anything that you want before we end it?
Yeah, everything's at stanefferding.com. That's my website. I've got my Vertical Diet 4.0 ebook now that was co-authored by an RDN PhD who was director of dietetics at UNLV and an instructor in their exercise physics department. We worked hard to make sure it was very well referenced with over 200 references, but it covers everything, sleep, hydration, blood tests, training, rehab, and all that kind of stuff. It covers everything. And then I own a nationwide meal prep company. I make Monster Mash and a host of other meals, and I ship them to people's doors all over the country. And that's also, you can click a link at stanefferding.com to get to the Vertical Diet to order meals. And then my YouTube, I have a whole host of those Rhino's Rants.
Yeah,
and that's Stan Efferding. And then the Instagram. Yeah, those are fun. I made them many years ago. If I look back over them, there's a few things I would change, just like I updated my vertical diet from the 1 to the 2 to the 3 to
That's
the
the way
current
it is,
4.0.
though. Nothing's perfect right away. Nothing.
Nothing's perfect. It evolves, and science changes, and we as we discussed today on many topics, I've evolved as well. And then Instagram is at Stan Efferding, so everything's there.
All right, Stan. Thank you very much, bro. I appreciate it.